The Institute for Economic Affairs is one of the many right-wing think tanks in the UK that are omnipresent in our media, but rather secretive about the source of their funds. Now, one of their number, Reem Ibrahim, was on Politics Live with George Monbiot debating the importance of economic growth when this happened.
I would be interested in how you would like to measure general well-being, because ultimately I think we all want the world to be a better place. We all want the country to be a better place to live in. But ultimately I think that is done not through more government, but less. And I actually do think that by allowing businesses and allowing those individuals to trade with one another, that's how we can achieve that kind of growth. And I don't think that growth is a bad thing. I think growth is a very positive thing. It's very politically charged. Both parties seem to think that they have an idea of how to get there. But ultimately, if we're actively implementing policies that are not going to be supporting the way in which the economy is growing, we've got to stop talking about growth in that way.
Well, of course you want to rip down regulations. Of course you don't care about the natural world. Because you're from the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is funded by oligarchs and corporations. George. Yes, and I should be. And actually the BBC should be as well, because the BBC says that the funding and affiliations of the organisations which come onto its programmes should be revealed. But the IEA pointedly and continually refuses to reveal who funds it. When we find out who funds you, we discover it's oil companies, it's tobacco companies, it's George. The most ruthless and rapacious companies on earth, and you're their spokesperson.
Now, this has been a talking point sort of in the British media for a very, very long time. You know, the Institute for Economic Affairs and these right-wing think tanks don't make clear who's funding them. And I have to say, I suppose just partly because of the passage of time, I ended up getting a bit like, oh yeah, I know this, let's move on. You know, like when you've heard a story, when you've sort of heard a controversy so many times, you can sort of have, yeah, I get it now. What's kind of changed this is I watched this week Big Oil versus the World. It's actually quite an old documentary, but it's on iPlayer at the moment. And what it sort of lays out is how there was a consensus on climate change, sort of in the early 80s, late 70s. And then what you got was Big Oil essentially funding loads and loads of think tanks to basically flood the whole media space with bullshit, right? And that, I think, did have a material impact in slowing down our response to climate change. Probably lots of people will die because those lobby groups were set up and were funded by those oil executives, those oil companies. And then people sort of did pose as independent, skeptical scientists, right? When actually they were just doing the work of corporate interests. You know, and it will have a terrible effect for all of us. You also might say, well, why do these people need to be funded? You know, it's not expensive to go on Politics Live. Like I go on Politics, well, I don't get invited anymore, but I go on some of these shows, you know, and I don't need any sort of dark funding to do it, because all you need to do is have some ideas and turn up on time. But it is the case, I think, with the IEA, etc. They have an office which is right by all of those studios. So right by the Politics Live studio, right by the Sky studio, sort of in the midst of Westminster. So they're always around the corner. And I do think it's the case that as a producer, you know that there's this organization where people are a 5-minute walk away from you. The company has enough funding to sort of strategically invest in media training for all of their staff. And so for all of these media companies, it's just perfect, right? Oh, we need a right-wing opinion and we need some balance. Let's go to those people who are 5 minutes down the road, will answer the phone, you know, any hour of the day, and are all media trained, right? So the funding definitely does put them at an advantage. Not everyone can afford a central London office right next to all the major TV studios. We can't, for example, right? We're miles away from those, or kilometres away from those TV studios in South London as we are. Let's look at the response of the staff member at the Institute for Economic Affairs. This is Reem Ibrahim's response.
This is some kind of wild conspiracy that he's incredibly obsessed with. And look, I appreciate that this is the kind of thing that you're obsessed with individually. I would like to actually talk about the policy matters at hand, because I actually would like to talk about the way in which people in this country are suffering.
And on whose behalf are you talking?
Myself, I'm talking about myself.
And you just happen to be employed by the Institute of Economic Affairs,
absolutely. Look,
which happens to be funded by oligarchs.
Well, George, you don't dispute her motives. That's what her motives are.
I do dispute her motives.
Let's talk about effectively what George is saying is he thinks that I'm being funded by dark lobbyists because he doesn't think that I believe the things that I'm saying, which I think is incredibly offensive for you to sit here and tell me that I don't believe the things that I'm saying. I come from countries that have been decimated by socialism. I believe in individual liberty. I believe in free markets, and I believe in people having the power to spend their own money without governments taking it from them. So I'm incredibly offended by this insinuation.
And like the other dark money think tank staff,
all right, listen, George, just there's two things.
Dahlia, was George Monbiot being incredibly offensive for imputing sinister motives or dark money influencing what the guest was saying?
I mean, it's like critical thinking history 101 to question sources, right? I don't think there was anything untoward or unusual about George Monbiot questioning the fact that this organization that is that receives very disproportionate levels of airtime and has done for decades. The Institute of Economic Affairs is not a new phenomenon. It has been shaping the political and economic landscape of this country for a very long time. Liz Truss's disastrous budget was essentially an IEA sponsored budget, in the sense that it was very heavily influenced. She was very heavily influenced by the IEA. And the fallout of that is something that ordinary people are still paying the price for. So it's certainly extremely relevant to think, well, why hasn't this think tank that led to such a unanimously understood disaster in the economy still considered to be an authoritative voice on economic issues? And I think that you're completely right to talk about what the kind of business model of the IEA is. The model is to put bums on seats. It's to essentially subsidize people like Reem Ibrahim, who started off as like a TikToks person, and then was kind of picked up by the IEA. And what they would basically say is, we're going to subsidize you and pay you a wage to essentially be on call, so that whenever a producer needs to put a bum on a seat or an editor needs someone to pen an article on something, you will be there and ready. The rest of us have jobs that means that we can't always be on call and we can't always be on demand to fill these kinds of positions. And so by that way, they just have like a breadth and scale model of just, if we can get enough people saying the same talking points on enough programs, if you say something enough times, it becomes true, or it gets an inflated sense of its importance and its validity. And when it comes to her being so offended that George Monbiot would kind of interrogate the role of he's not really interrogating her. He's not concerned with her. He's concerned with this tendency that her presence there represents, which is that an ultimately very small and very opaque organization has gained a huge amount of influence on the political and economic imagination of this country, and this idea of what is politically and economically possible. And that is something that in a democracy should be scrutinized, and she wouldn't be so defensive if it was something that she was proud of or that she felt transparent about. But ultimately, I'm sure that Reem Ibrahim believes everything that she says. None of us are particularly concerned about what she thinks and how she feels. What we're concerned about is, as George Monbiot said, on whose behalf and for what reason are you sitting in this very influential seat, Politics Live, primetime political TV, and, giving your analysis. What is the organization, and on whose authority are you here? That is a question that, if you're there, you should be able to answer. I think it was very strange that it was seen as almost breaking a fourth wall for that to be questioned. It kind of breaks there's a sort of protocol that breaks there, which is, it's a protocol that kind of underpins the entire kind of commentator class. And I can say that as someone who has occasionally participated in it, and that it is very much based on no one really asking these particular questions.